This is the banner or flag that was carried by the miners during the riots. It's the Scottish flag with the Southern Cross. Either side of the words roll up, roll up. The top is no, and here is Chinese.
Gold was discovered in June 1860. Word got around and the place filled up, and there were 20,000 people there, and about 2,000 of them were Chinese. And there were many other races, lots of Germans, a few French, quite a few Italians.
Because it wasn't one town, it was just a whole series of villages. Every business known to man was here. The hotels, shooting galleries, bowling alleys, I said circuses, dance halls, including the sly grog shops, which the miners actually burnt down and destroyed, because they were seen as the nest of the thieves and the robbers.
Some of the early riots they started off being for the good and welfare and good character of the miners. They were against the opium dens and against the brothels. But they very soon turned into sheer naked racism.
They wanted the Chinese gone. Now, whether that was right or wrong at the time, and they came up with a whole series of reasons. That the European miners, they dug their dirt through the week, and then on a Saturday they washed it. The Chinese washed every day, and when there wasn't much water, you foul the water, well, you've got nothing to drink. And water was very expensive to buy if there wasn't much around. So, and then they came up with all the other things as well. I wouldn't say that was racism. I'd say it was more just because they were different.
Lambing Flat was known as a poor man's field. The gold was on the surface. You'd dig up shovelfuls of material and you might only get half a jar full of gold flakes. They worked with their friends and they worked as a team because they were good at getting the gold, whereas the other miners, the mostly European miners, were individuals, or they had a mate or two. They might have worked 2 or 3 together, but not in a big group. And so they worked as individuals. And having got rich, they'd take off individually themselves. And so the others not being very lucky. And so they saw that the Chinese were very efficient in getting gold. And, I think that bred the racism and the protesting.
Unions didn't want the Chinese here because they worked for a lot less money than other people.
The government did everything it could to protect the Chinese, and the police would move them to what they thought was a safe place for the Chinese to mine. And the last of those was Blackguard Gully, and the rioters returned in great force and drove them off. George O'Malley Clark, the Gold Commissioner, he was the man responsible for seeing there was law and order on the goldfield.
There's various stories about who actually fired first. Then the police actually charged on horseback, went through the miners and then went back again. One miner apparently lost half his face, and the next day, was that night, Bupton was the only person that's recorded through this whole process, the whole period of the 18 months of riots and carry on. He was the only one reported killed. And the next day at his funeral, there was reported about 30 or 40 miners with bandages all over their bodies from the night before. Reading
the character of the tumult in the goldfield, had already talked to Mr. Roberts down at Currawong Station, and so he said to the Chinese, as you're leaving, if you can go over that hill, go down that way and turn left a bit, you'll end up at Currawong Station, and Mr. Roberts there will give you shelter. And that's what happened. 1,200 odd Chinese went through the night, walking, carrying what they could, nursing their wounds, and got to Currawong Station. And for 2 to 3 weeks, the Robertses looked after them, fed them in the bitter winter weather, gave them as much shelter as they could, and they eventually trickled back to Sydney, I think. Some would have gone on to other mines, but I think most, taking the lesson, would have sought refuge in Sydney, where there already was, as around all the Pacific ports, there were already a decent Chinatown. There may have been a few thick-skinned ones who decided to stay.
The Premier came here in the March of 1861 and told the diggers that he would do something about the Chinese, introduce a bill. Well, he went back to Sydney, and they did nothing. Nothing happened. And the 14th of July, when the miners attacked the police camp, after that, that's when the government reacted and actually sent a lot of people down here to take over. And that was what prompted the government then to introduce the Chinese Restriction Act. They could have reacted earlier. They had the chance very early on to declare this area a goldfield. They delayed doing that, which is why the Miners Vigilance Committee was formed.